All right, welcome Sterling College. We're so glad to have you viewing us. My name is Paul Brandis. I serve as the chaplain here, and I'm joined today by two of my friends, Dr. Butner and Dr. Gabrielson. Glenn, do you want to go ahead and just wave and say hello to everyone?
Hi, everybody. Hope you're all doing well.
And same thing for you, Tim. Do you want to go ahead and wave and say hello to everybody?
Hello, everyone. Hope you're doing well, and quarantine is not going so bad for all of you.
Yes, yeah, we are doing this event in this format, like Tim mentioned, because of quarantine. We actually had two different iterations of this plan. We were going to do this in chapel on Sunday, April 5th, and we're not able to do that when we adjusted to online classes. And then we were actually planning to gather in person and record this video. And then the state of Kansas went on a stay-at-home order. And so we are coming to you from the comforts of our own home to record this event that we had planned and wanted to continue to try to bring to you because we believe this is so important. And the question that we're answering today or trying to answer today, seeking to answer today, has particular relevance during this week. Today is Wednesday, April 8th. We are smack in the middle of Holy Week, which you can refer back to the podcast that I recorded on Monday if you need a primer on what Holy Week is. And so we thought that this event, this conversation could fit really well in the midst of this week. And of course, what it is that we're discussing is the possibility of Jesus's resurrection. Central to the Christian faith is the belief that Jesus really died and yet really rose again. And in fact, the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, which is such an important passage to this conversation about Jesus' resurrection, he says in verse 19, he says this: "If in Christ we have hope only in this life, then we are of all people most to be pitied." In other words, what the Apostle Paul is saying is, if Jesus didn't really rise from the dead, if this Christian walk, if this Christian journey, if this following Jesus thing, if this is only about this life and doesn't contain any lasting hope for the next life, then we of all people are to be most pitied. And so in many, many ways, one of the most important questions any of us can ask is this one that we are seeking to answer in this video. Could Christ have risen? And I'm so glad that I'm not alone in this conversation, but I have two of my incredibly smart friends here with me to try to help answer that. And Tim, we're gonna go ahead and start with you, and you're gonna be guiding us in the historical portion of this conversation, as in, does the narrative that we find in history indicate that there's good reason to believe that Jesus really rose from the dead? That's your task for today. Is that right, Tim?
That is correct. That will be what I hope to prove
yes,
today.
Of course, we approach these with a good degree of humility. But in that journey, in the historical journey, what criteria, we can use any number of criteria, but what criteria do you find and do you count as most important as we walk along that journey?
I think there are four criteria that are particularly important for understanding the resurrection of Jesus from the dead: time lapse, independent testimony, historical coherence, and then finally explanatory power. So just briefly, what we mean by all of those is time lapse. The closer you are to the event that happened and the written source that records that event, obviously that's better. The closer you are to it, it just gives it more accuracy if you're closer. In terms of independent testimony, the number of people who mention this as important and happening gives it more likelihood that it occurred. But of course, you want those to be independent. You don't just want the same person saying things 50 times. You want lots of different people who don't have direct connections to each other to say the same thing, and that gives it more backing and more likelihood of being correct. In terms of historical coherence, it should make sense of the world, and there should just be a good sense of fit, that this fits the world and the time that it was to have taken place. And then finally, explanatory power. The basic logic here is, if you can't explain later events without this event, it makes it more likely that this event occurred.
Awesome. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. And we're going to take the first two of those, time lapse and independent testimony, which on those, I thought of the illustration of, let's say that I were to claim that I bowled a perfect game, a 300. It would make probably better sense that, or it would be easier to believe me if I was saying that I bowled a game of 300 yesterday versus I did this 15 years ago. And it certainly would make more sense or be more believable if I said that I bowled a perfect game if there was a bunch of other people that weren't connected to one another in any sort of way, right? So my friend that was with me, but also the person that sold me the shoes, and then the guy at the lane next to me, if all of them are like, yeah, no, Paul bowled a perfect game yesterday, then you would start to believe that I bowled a perfect game, even though that's not something that's ever actually happened. So we're going to look at that, apply those criteria of time lapse and independent accounts to this event, Jesus's resurrection. And so go ahead and talk about those related not to Paul bowling or not bowling a perfect game, but go ahead and talk about those two criteria as it pertains to the resurrection of Jesus and kind of walk us through that. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. So to take time lapse is the first one. To be a different Paul, not you, but the ancient apostle Paul, who lived in the first century, a follower of Jesus. The key passage is a letter he writes to the church in Corinth. It's known as 1 Corinthians. And in the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians, Paul records sort of a creed or saying, and he says this starting in verse 3. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. Paul continues to write about appearances to others and so forth. But this is a really key passage because this letter is written about 54, 55 AD is about when it's written. Jesus' resurrection is about 30 AD. So within 25 years or so of Jesus' death and resurrection, we have somebody saying that this happened and it occurred. But when you look at the fact that Paul says not only he's writing to them at that point, but that he had already passed it on to them earlier, we know that he first visited Corinth somewhere around 51 or 52 AD. But additional to that, not only did he pass on to it, but he said he himself received it. Well, presumably the people he received it from are the people who had all of these appearances to them, people like Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, and John and others. And when Paul first visited Jerusalem, we know that was his second visit to Jerusalem. His most recent visit to Jerusalem before he went to Corinth was 48 or so AD. So when you look at it, we can definitely say that Paul had already received this as the central statement of Christian belief, that Jesus died and raised from the dead by 48 or so AD. So that's within 2 decades of the event that was to have occurred. And by historical standards, that's amazing. When you look at other religions, for example, in Buddhism, even the first biography of the Buddha, Siddhartha, is about 500 years after when he occurred. And we're talking about 20 years, within 20 years. So already it's a really strong criteria. But if we can assume that Paul maybe, we don't know for sure, but if Paul actually picked up this saying that Jesus' death and resurrection, he received it when he first visited Jerusalem, which seems likely, though we can't prove that. But if indeed it happened on his first visit to Jerusalem, that happened around 37, 38. So there's at least a decent reason to think that the idea that Jesus died and was raised from the dead was the central Christian belief within a decade. It's pretty astounding when you think about it.
Well, and I so agree, Tim. I think that is astounding within a decade. And I really appreciate even the comparison to other religions where that's really, really close, because I even think my example of bowling a perfect game might be a little bit misleading, where I'm saying, oh, well, I bowled it yesterday versus I bowled it 15 years ago. But in that sense, we're comparing a little bit apples and oranges, a bowling game and a historical event like Jesus's resurrection or the founding of Buddhism. Those are a little different. And so when we're talking about something like Jesus rising from the dead, under a decade is what we really think we have. That is really incredible. So yeah, in terms of time lapse, that's a very strong criteria. What about your second one, independent accounts?
Yeah, so obviously, as you mentioned with your bowling analogy, you not only want lots of people mentioning this to make it more believable, but you don't want them, if it was the exact same group of friends or something, it might be less believable because it's possible that they all just spread one idea and they're all just kind of parroting or copying each other. So when you look at the New Testament and other early Christian literature going to about the year 200 or a little after, there are a number of bodies of literature. You have the New Testament, but you also have writings called the Apostolic Fathers, the Apologists, there's New Testament Apocrypha, and then outside of the Roman Empire, there's also Syriac Christianity. And when you look at all of those different documents, probably somewhere around 90% of them all mention the resurrection as a central and important way for understanding Christianity. And it's important to note that they're not all coordinated. Even the New Testament, we think of it as very coordinated because it currently exists in one book in our Bibles together. But Paul didn't necessarily even know the gospel accounts. Well, he's writing before any of the gospels are written. And so it's not as though Paul had access to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John when he's writing. He's doing this independently of those gospels. And those gospels are, for the most part, written independently of each other as well. And the other early Christian literature often doesn't know each other. So what we have is, for 200 years or so, mostly independent accounts, and they're all mentioning the resurrection as important. And with the exception of a small group of Christians known as Gnostic Christians, no one is spiritualizing this as Jesus' soul going up into heaven or anything like that. Everyone is agreeing that a resurrection means a physical resurrection, somebody who was dead coming back to life again. So there's lots and lots of independent testimony.
Wonderful. Yeah, no, I mean, and that is helpful when we step back and realize that we can even step outside of the Bible to see things within the Bible as then there's coherence between those accounts. And how about that word coherence with the historical coherence and then the explanatory power? I know that those are the other two criteria that we're going to take a look at. Can you talk a little bit more of those with regard to the historical coherence? How does this fit Jesus' resurrection with other verified events, and with the explanatory power? How necessary would it be to account for other events that came after it?
Yes. So in terms of historical coherence, it fits well. It fits right into the context that we know of Palestine, the Roman Empire, what was happening in and around Jesus' time. So certainly everything leading up to Jesus' death and resurrection, what typically happened to people who claimed to be the Messiah and how Rome killed them and everything, all of that fits the political and social context of first century Palestine perfectly. And in terms of the resurrection specifically, it definitely also coheres with current belief. Not all Jews believed in a resurrection, but it was believed by Pharisees, by the Essenes, by a number of different Jewish groups of the day, as well as the early Christians. They believed in the concept of a resurrection that would happen, although they typically believed that resurrection would happen only at the end of time. So overall, it fits the details as far as we could expect it to fit. So it fits the details of the time well. I think even stronger than the historical coherence argument, though, is the explanatory power argument. And this basically says, from other later verified accounts, things that we know happened, do we need this event to explain what happened later? If you took this out, would you have all these gaps and strange question marks for how did that happen and why did that happen? And I think this is a very strong argument, because we know that for the most part, what a Messiah meant to the people in first century Judea or Palestine was a political revolutionary who would overthrow the Romans and would become sort of a new David or a new great king for the people. They would drive out the Romans and they would establish their own independent nation again. And that's what it meant to be a Messiah in most people's mind. And so when Jesus claimed to be a Messiah, he was not the only one. There were a handful of others, at least, who claimed to be Messiah. We have records of them. One who did it in the years 132 to 135 is known as Bar Kokhba, and he claimed to be a Messiah, and he threw out the Romans for 3 years until the Romans crushed his rebellion. But we know exactly what Messiahs were meant to do and what they claimed and what they seemed. And what happened is every time a Messiah died, his movement died. A dead Messiah was no Messiah at all, and therefore the movement scattered. And we can see this is exactly what the disciples thought was happening when Jesus was resurrected. When Jesus was killed. That's why Peter denied him, is because Peter was trying to cut his losses and save his life, because they thought, well, I guess Jesus isn't the Messiah after all because he's being killed by the Romans. So a dead Messiah is no Messiah at all. And yet, for some reason, of all the messianic movements in and around the first century, only Christianity survives, and does so obviously greatly. You have to explain that somehow, and the resurrection makes great explanation for why that would happen. It's also important to say that the eyewitnesses, the people who at least claim to have seen Jesus raised from the dead, are the ones who died for the resurrection. So unless they had a lie that they would rather give up their life to protect a lie, it seems very likely that they believed they really had seen Jesus alive and had been resurrected from the dead, and they were willing to die for that. So a lot of people gave their life for this belief in the first generation of Christians. And then a final point that I think is worth noting is, even if they had all agreed Jesus raised from the dead and everything, if they were just making it up, they would have made something different up, because we also know accounts of the day usually pictured the resurrection in more like the body of an angel or a star, something that was glowing or shining or something like that. So if all the early Christians had gotten together and just agreed to come up with the story of Jesus' resurrection, the accounts of the resurrection that we actually get are not at all what we would expect. We would expect instead Jesus to have emerged from the tomb as a shining, glorious, angelic-like figure, but he doesn't emerge like that. He emerges as a human, one that's not exactly recognizable, but is sort of recognizable. He's physical, but he's definitely different in some sense, it seems like, but not an angel-like. And that's exactly what we would have expected to occur. And there would have been lots of other options. You could have seen Jesus as just his soul going up to heaven, and he'd play a special part at the resurrection at the end of time or something. There would have been a lot of other more likely stories that Christians would have come up with. It's very unlikely that this is the story they would have chosen if they were totally making it up. So I think the explanatory power argument is quite strong, because it's hard to make sense of what happens in the remainder of the first century, second century, and after, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead.
Yeah, I agree. The explanatory power argument has always been personally really compelling to me, and I agree. You know, the accounts that we get in the Gospels of the resurrected Jesus, they're not what we would expect from that time, and they're really beautiful, right? There's a difference in Jesus, in the sense that, you know, one of the accounts says that the disciples were all really scared, understandably, because again, a dead Messiah is no Messiah, and they thought that their lives were at stake. And so they're huddled in a locked room, and then all of a sudden Jesus just appears with them there. So I've always taken that to mean that Jesus can kind of like float through walls after he is risen from the dead, but he's not a ghost. The gospel writers also take these painful, not painful, but painstaking attempts to describe Jesus' physicality. So he sits with his disciples on the beach and he has breakfast with them. And there's something even beautiful about his wounds carrying through into the resurrection. So he has the wounds in his hands and his feet, that when doubting Thomas finally is able to see him, Jesus invites Thomas to actually feel those. So there's a physicality there, but there's just this beautiful similarity and dissimilarity in Jesus' resurrected body that we see there, that, like Tim, to your point, would not have been really what we would have expected from the writers of that day, unless it were something that were true. So I think the explanatory power argument is also really compelling. And it would even make sense too of my bowling analogy, right? If I were to quit my job as the chaplain of Sterling College tomorrow to embark upon a professional bowling career, everyone would go, what the heck is Paul doing? But if you knew that I had bowled a perfect game yesterday, then you might go, oh, that makes a little more sense of why he's doing this. So you can use that explanatory power criteria to say what event makes best sense of this. And as Tim did a great job of outlining, there's a ton of evidence that seems to suggest that the resurrection of Jesus, the physical bodily resurrection of Jesus after he had really died, makes best sense of a lot of other events that came after it later. So Tim, thank you so much for that. Really appreciate your thoughts there. And Glenn, even though this is something that the three of us believe, that Jesus really rose from the dead, and it is one of the most discussed events of all time, what did Jesus rise from the dead or not? Not everyone believes this, quite obviously. And so in seeking to explain what happened other than the resurrection, there have been alternative theories that have been used throughout history to try to explain what happened. If it's not Jesus rising from the dead, then what is it? And you're going to take us through a few of those theories, Glenn, and then you're also going to use some of that criteria to do so that Tim outlined. Is that right? That's kind of your task for us?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. And go ahead. What are a couple of those theories that you want to first bring us up to speed on?
Sure. So anytime that we're trying to explain any historical event, no matter how random, we can always come up with multiple theories to explain it. So I could say, why do I have a transformer here with me? And I could tell you that it's because there's a global pandemic that's requiring me to now record all of my lectures in my 5-year-old's room. And if you first heard that and haven't been watching the news, that might sound like a really implausible explanation for what happened. And you might come up with lots of other theories for why I have a transformer here. But if we spent the time to work through the theories and eliminate them through a process of elimination, it would add more plausibility to the theory that I put forward. So that's what historians began to do around the 1700s, when skepticism about the Bible became more culturally common. And there were a number of pieces of evidence they had to explain, and Dr. Gabrielson's already mentioned some. Why is it that early Christians have a different view of the resurrection than people before them? Why is it that Christianity spread and other messianic groups didn't last? Why is it that Christians all agree that the resurrection is important? Some of the early theories weren't very good alternatives. One of them is known as the Swoon Theory. The idea basically was Jesus passed out on the cross. It looked like he died. So they took him down, put him in a grave. He woke up a little bit later and appeared, and everybody said, oh, he rose from the dead. At first glimpse, it seems like maybe this fits the independent testimony criterion pretty well, because we do, of course, have lots of different accounts that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was on the cross. So it seemed to make sense to some scholars in the 1700s. Yet, if we look at explanatory power and we dig a little bit more deeply, we find it really wasn't a very good alternative explanation. First of all, we have to assume that the Roman guards who were crucifying him, and who were very skilled at their jobs, by the way, somehow didn't realize that he wasn't dead. A soldier who failed to execute somebody he was charged to execute could actually face the death penalty himself. So these were soldiers that were skilled at killing and that had a lot on the line if they failed to kill someone. And the theory says it just so happens that they failed at their job. So that doesn't really make a lot of sense about what we know from historical context. So maybe it'd be better to call that the coherence criteria. But we also can look at what happened after Jesus appeared again. And that is that there's this massive new religion that emerges, that they debate a lot of things. There's a whole lot of debate we see on the pages of the New Testament about whether or not Jesus required us to follow the law, whether or not new Gentile Christians should do that, for example. But we don't see anywhere near that amount of debate on the question of whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. And in fact, we see a lot of people willing to die for that belief. But we have to wonder, if somebody saw a nearly dead Jesus who appears having passed out at the brink of death on the cross, would that have really led them to believe that he rose from the dead? Or would they have said, wow, what a lucky break, Jesus. You know, they tried to kill you and they made a mistake. It seems more feasible to say that that wouldn't lead to a new religion. Or at least if it did, that there would be some disagreement there. But we don't actually have any texts that claim that he just passed out, or that the resurrection, was a hoax. So that theory is not really held by many historians today. There's one more that was put forward early on that's not really accepted, and that's the possibility that maybe there was a mass hallucination. So maybe driven by grief and the loss of Jesus, everybody thought that they saw him appear after his death. Again, there are some problems here. This doesn't seem to explain what follows. So the book of Acts in chapter 1, verse 3, for example, it says that Jesus was with the disciples for 40 days. But we know hallucinations don't last that long. Hallucinations aren't experienced en masse, a large group. We also know that the disciples were hiding in the upper room, afraid that they were going to be killed. Peter had denied Jesus. Usually hallucinations are experienced by people expecting something, but there's really no evidence that the disciples were expecting Jesus to rise from the dead. In fact, usually if someone puts something in a historical document that makes them look foolish, historians are more likely to say that it's true. So Jesus being denied by Peter, the disciples being afraid in the upper room, that leads historians to say, well, that probably happened. But 20 years later, they're dying for the faith. A hallucination doesn't really explain that either. So again, most historians today say these theories aren't viable alternatives.
Yeah, no, I know. I've heard the swoon one a number of times before, and it's good to hear you keep up on this writing even more than I do. But it's good to hear that people aren't submitting that one as something that is even a real possibility, because that one always just made me chuckle a little bit. Because again, not only were the Roman soldiers really excellent at their jobs, but they even in the account we see it's not, because in crucifixion you die through suffocation actually, but Jesus died a lot quicker even than a lot of other people do. So to make sure that he was dead from suffocation, they stabbed him in the side with a spear. So it's one of those to me that always seemed like, boy, the swoon theory doesn't hold a lot of water. So but there are others that even in more modern sort of conversations about these alternatives are still submitted, and I know you've got a couple more for us. So what are some of those other theories, Glenn, that people do think might hold a little bit of water at some level?
Sure. So if you went to a state school, for example, and took a course on the New Testament in a religious studies department, you might hear one of these theories. And in fact, when I went to University of North Carolina, these are the theories I was introduced to and that I had to weigh through and decide they still weren't very compelling. One of them is that the disciples just lost Jesus's body. So there's a historian, John Dominic Crossan, who thinks that Jesus was just buried in an unmarked grave and nobody could find the body. And so it led to the belief in a resurrection. There's another scholar, Kearsarge Lake, who thinks that the disciples accidentally went to the wrong tomb. They found it empty and they came back and said, oh, Jesus rose from the dead. Superficially, those sound possible, but again, when you use the criteria, this theory doesn't really come out very well. First of all, in terms of historical coherence, how does this fit with what else we know from this historical time period? Well, in Mark 15:43, we're told that Joseph of Arimathea is the one who buried Jesus. And it's really interesting that he's the one who's named as the giver of the tomb for Christ, because we know he was a member of the Sanhedrin. And Mark 14 tells us that they all, meaning all the members of the Sanhedrin, voted to execute Jesus. So here's a man that voted to kill Jesus that still kindly gives the tomb. Because this is kind of embarrassing. None of Jesus's followers provided a tomb. One of the executors had to. Again, historians say that's probably true, which if that's the case, people know where the tomb is. It may be that some might have lost the body, but why is it that no historical source comes forward and says, hey, actually go look in Joseph's tomb, there's the body? This also fails the criteria of explanatory power. There was really, again, nobody Jewish who was expecting an isolated resurrection. The resurrection happens at the end of history with everybody, not an individual. And you expected a resurrection to result in a body that's shining with light and looking like an angel, as Dr. Gabrielson said. But none of the resurrection accounts explain that. So if it was just a lost body, why do we have this new Christian belief that doesn't fit any pre-existing versions of the belief in the resurrection? Again, this theory falls short. Another explanation that you might hear in a class of that sort is that this is all a hoax. There are some early texts that claim against Christians that that this is all made up. But again, this doesn't really fit the evidence. The Bible does share that Roman soldiers were paid to claim that Jesus's body was stolen, which suggests that the theory is around, but it doesn't really fit, again, with explanatory power. If the disciples knew that this was a lie, if it was a hoax they made up, where was their motive to die for the faith? Why would they die for this lie? I mean, there's no money. The Bible tells us early church members gave most of their things away to the poor. There's really no earthly power. The Roman authorities and the Jewish authorities persecuted early Christians. You'd get kicked out of the synagogue, cut off from your family. What motive would there be to die for this if it was only a lie? And yet we see so many of the early Christian leaders who would have had to make up this hoax being willing to die, which all suggests that it wasn't actually a hoax. Fifth and final possible theory is that this is all just myth. The whole thing is a story that somebody made up later on. Sometimes you'll see a strange version of this on the internet, that Jesus is one of many mythical gods that dies and rises again. And that Christianity is just another example of this myth. There are a lot of problems there, one being that a lot of these parallel myths aren't actually the same, but let's focus on our criteria. The first is time lapse. We have, within a couple of decades, claims that Jesus rose from the dead. If this whole thing was made up, people are going around saying, hey, do you remember 20 years ago, that guy Jesus? And nobody remembered. Why would it catch on as a new religion? Why don't we have any evidence of people saying, well, no, actually, we know that there wasn't a Jesus, or that his story didn't happen the way you expected? If you want to pull off a myth like this, scholars tell us myths usually begin, centuries after the event, not decades. And again, we have a problem of explanatory power. We do actually see some myths about Christ that occur centuries after he died. One of my favorites is supposedly he wrote a letter to this famous king and convinced the king to become a Christian. But we can look back now and we can see that's an obvious hoax because the king lived centuries after Jesus died. We don't have any obvious holes in the story like that when it comes to the Gospels. So if these are our best alternatives, I've concluded that I think the best explanation is that there was an actual resurrection, that this inspired the disciples to believe to the point they'd be willing to die, that this led to the new widespread Christian belief in a different version of the resurrection, and that this led to agreement by many eyewitnesses that Jesus was in fact raised from the dead.
Yeah, no, I thank you so much, Glenn. And I think probably one of the things that's most important from your answers is, and you established this so beautifully, is that you have to do something with this question. Did Jesus rise from the dead? And what we don't see at really any level of sort of high-level academic historical work is people just ignoring the question of Jesus's resurrection. We see alternative theories, and we see Christian historians submitting why they think that the resurrection makes best sense of the evidence, but we don't have anyone just saying, well, we don't have to talk about that because it is such a seminal claim. And there's so much to explain. How is it that 2 billion people in the world today say that they are followers of Jesus? How in the world did that happen? And the three of us and many others submit that the best evidence for how that happened is that Jesus really did die and that he really did rise again. Now, there's people that don't believe that, and then they submit some of the theories that Dr. Butner has so eloquently described. And I think what we want to do and what we'll do at the end here is we want to say to you all, we would love you to do the same thing. Just not dealing with Jesus's resurrection on an intellectual level probably isn't a really smart way forward, because of what is potentially at stake here. So thank you, Dr. Butner, for that. And there are other objections to this. Those are some of the alternative theories. But one of the objections is that, well, if something like this were to happen, this is a miracle. This this would be a miracle if someone was to come back from the dead. We all have lost loved ones in our life, and we don't expect them to come back from the dead. So maybe miracles like this just aren't scientifically possible. And that's the age we live in now, is the age of science and the reason. We're past the Enlightenment. And so a lot of people will talk about that related to the resurrection, that miracles aren't scientifically possible. Dr. Butner, I wonder if you could speak to that for just a moment.
Sure. And I'll be a little bit quicker on this answer because I always like to warn students I'm not a scientist. So to get further information on this, you should probably talk to a scientist. But I do teach a lot in the philosophy of religion. And it's interesting, the discussion about miracles in the philosophy of religion has changed a lot over the past decade or two because of the advance in quantum mechanics. So some new disciplines in the science of atoms and subatomic particles. And essentially the way the debate used to look is philosophers would argue miracles can't happen. They violate the laws of nature, to which a Christian would have to respond that the laws of nature can be violated. Much in the same way, if you drop an apple, you can reach out and catch that apple to stop it from falling. The laws only apply if there's no intervention. And so God must have intervened here. So the law didn't apply. Normally, if you die, you stay dead. That's the law. But if God intervenes, it's not true. And then there would be a big debate about whether or not God can intervene. But it's weird that things have shifted since quantum mechanics, because that many of those scientific theories now suggest that the laws are really just probabilities. A law is the result of an aggregate or a summary, a grouping together of lots of atomic events on a very small level. And so if you get the number of atoms large enough, then a law is the result that shows what the average is. But technically speaking, that average doesn't have to occur. That law is the norm, but there's nothing scientifically speaking that says it can't be otherwise. And that sounds kind of strange. So let me give you an example from a philosopher of religion. So if I take the same transformer, since it's what I have here, technically, if I let go of it, you would expect it to fall. So it's coming in handy. But it's not impossible that if I let go of it, all of these atoms just happen to reappear over here. It's immensely improbable. So improbable that in the entire history of the universe, it probably won't happen. But technically, it's not impossible. So what that means is something like a dead body coming back to life. Scientifically, we can't say it's impossible. We would just say that on its own, it's very improbable. So we can't say science says it's not possible for there to be a resurrection, because that's not the conclusion that modern scientific theory would lead us to.
Well, and I find that fascinating. So some of the smartest non-Christian scientists have really stopped talking about impossibility and start talking, scientifically speaking, about improbability. Have I summarized you? And I shouldn't just say non-Christians. Both Christian and non-Christian super smart scientists have shifted this conversation in the last decade. Is that summarizing kind of?
Yes, and even more so philosophers of religion that study scientific theories.
Okay, wonderful. Well, and it is really that fascinates me. But even within that, then, okay, so not impossibility, maybe even the law is not the right way to talk about that anymore. So we're not talking impossibility, but we're talking improbability. And yet, even still, I wonder, doesn't the resurrection of Jesus, doesn't that score pretty highly on the improbable scale? What would you say to that? I mean, can we really believe this? What does it say about us that we really believe this if it scores so highly on the improbable scale?
Sure. I mean, I think it's reasonable to find this improbable. I used to find it improbable. And if someone were to tell you that, I die next week and then I raise again 2 weeks after that, you should be very skeptical about that claim. But one thing that helped convince me that it's not actually that improbable is when we consider the fact that God is a part of the equation. So if we believe that there is a God, that this God is all powerful, and that this God has told us that he's going to raise Christ from the dead, then it makes sense that he in fact would raise Jesus from the dead. There's nothing scientifically impossible about it. There appears to be a lot of historical evidence that something like the resurrection happened, and God is able to do that if God exists. Well, suddenly the resurrection seems a lot more probable. So within the context of, if you're willing to consider one possible theory being that there is a God, then given that theory, the resurrection suddenly becomes something reasonable and even probable.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much to both of you. And I do just have one final question. I'd love both of your thoughts on this. And I'm going to state it, well, a little bit crassly and simply, but so what? So what? I mean, so let's say that, through the course of this video, I have been sort of led to believe, hey, this might have happened, or I'm thinking about the resurrection differently. So what? What does this matter? And this really leads back to what I was saying. I have a conviction that we can't leave this alone, and none of us should leave this question alone, that we have to answer Jesus's question that he posed to his disciples of, who do you say that I am? And then we have to deal with what we think about whether or not he really died and really rose again. And so help us kind of walk through that a little bit. So what? What are the practical implications of whether or not Jesus rose from the dead upon my life today? And Dr. Butner, we'll start with you.
Sure. I think in our internet generation, we are bombarded by interesting facts and details and crazy stories all the time. So we might be inclined to just say, oh, cool, Jesus rose from the dead. Another interesting story and detail to put back in my file cabinet to share with my friends at some point. But I think this story is different from any other interesting story you might hear because of what the resurrection signifies. The fact that God rose Christ from the dead confirms Jesus's identity, and it confirms his message. So God doesn't just raise criminals from the dead and villains from the dead. He doesn't raise evil people from the dead because he is God and he is good. At the end, the final resurrection, he will raise them unto judgment, the Bible teaches, but he doesn't just raise them in the course of history, leading entire groups of people to think they were the Messiah. So this tells us that when God raised Jesus from the dead, he was vindicating him. He was showing that Jesus is the Messiah, and that Jesus's message, which is that he had to give his life as a ransom for many, must be true, which means the resurrection is confirmation of the gospel. If you don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah, and you don't believe that he had to die for you, then that changes your eternal fate. You will no longer share in the resurrection that he has in the same way unto a relationship of communion and fellowship with God. So it's a very important piece of information. If Jesus died, we're saved, only if he was also raised. If he wasn't raised, as Paul says, it's nothing.
Yeah, and Tim, how about you on that same question? So what?
Yeah, so I think if the Christian claim, the fundamental Christian claim throughout all of Christianity's history, is that Jesus' death and resurrection are the center of human history, I think that makes an immense difference in terms of how we look at our lives. If you think about your grandparents, your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, most of us, obviously, we know, for the most part, we know our parents, we might know our grandparents, some of us know our great-grandparents, but you go back to great-great-grandparents or further, and almost none of us can say something definitive and meaningful about them. And when you think about that in our own life, that means that you wait 4, 5 generations, and all of us are forgotten. And what really ends us is death. Death ends the equation. We can try to make meaningful contributions in academics or sports or the arts or whatever it would be. We try to last a legacy. But the truth is the vast majority of us die, we are forgotten, and the world moves on. And that would be the end of the story if the resurrection is not true. In the end, everything is forgotten. You wait long enough, Alexander the Great will be forgotten. You wait long enough, and this world itself will become nothing and everything just ends in a cold, silent death as the universe ever expands. And that's the story. That's the grand story if, say, there is no God. But if Christianity is true and the resurrection is true, then instead all of our deaths, as long as they're submitted to God properly, is really just a step unto life. And I think that makes a difference in terms of how we look at self-sacrifice and how we look at others and how we look at the meaning of life, that life doesn't, have meaning seeped out of it and just taken away from it, but instead life is charged with meaning at every moment because there is hope beyond the grave, and because what we do now has an impact. And I don't know exactly how it has an impact, just as Jesus, when he was raised from the dead, still bore the scars of the cross. Maybe in certain ways what we do now will actually carry on to the physical eternity that we have. I don't know for sure, but what I do know is in the most important chapter in the New Testament on the resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15, which I mentioned earlier, Paul gives this long defense of why the resurrection must have happened and what its meaning is. And he ends by saying this. This is his final word about the resurrection. In verse 58 of chapter 15, he says, "Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourself fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord, in Jesus, is not in vain." And so to me, the importance of the resurrection is that charges with utter, profound, and immortal meaning what we do in our everyday lives. And that's to me, that's the big question. Is the end of my life, is the end of human history just meaningless and everything is forgotten and death wins? Or is it in the end fundamentally and passionately meaningful, and death always ends instead in life for those who are trusting in Christ Jesus as their Savior?
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more with both of you. And when I think about that question of so what, it makes me reflect upon what I've tried to do all year in chapel and in my work with our community, with our students, is really make plain, and I haven't hidden this for a moment, that I find Jesus and his ways simply irresistible and beautiful, and frankly better than any other way of life. And that's true for me, and I've tried to put that on display, and hopefully present that in a compelling manner. And the resurrection is the event. The resurrection of Jesus is the event that confirms why it is that Jesus and his ways are most beautiful, most compelling, and I think best. A spoken word artist by the name of Propaganda has a message, a video on the gospel, and one of the lines in it captivated me when I first heard it, gripped my heart, and it hasn't let go. He says that with his life on the cross, with his death on the cross, Jesus wrote a check. On the cross, Jesus wrote a check with his life, but at the resurrection, we all cheered because it means that the check cleared, right? That the check didn't bounce. Jesus wrote a check with his life, and it didn't bounce. He was good for it by coming back to life, by rising again, and it confirms, like Glenn said, his identity. It confirms his message. It gives us everyday meaning, like Tim said, and it really is the reason why I have submitted myself and my life to Jesus, to his way, to his teachings, to how he lived life, to how he loved others and gave himself away. And it's because we see in his resurrection something so beautiful and so astounding, and I think something that makes a lot of sense, as we've been talking about over the last few minutes, that it's what I've chosen and what these guys that are with me have chosen to give our lives to. And we hope that you are the same. If you are watching this and you're a follower of Jesus, we hope this has encouraged you to continue on the path that you're already walking. But we know that many of our students do not follow Jesus. And so if you're watching this and you are not a follower of Jesus, thank you for tuning in and sticking with us the whole time. We're really grateful that you did that. Wherever you're at, follower of Jesus or not, we want to provide you with a next step. And so in the email that you receive received this video in, I sent a link to this email. There is a link for you to click and say, hey, I want to take a next step. And maybe that's surrendering your life to Jesus. Maybe that is just doubling down on believing in the resurrection and its power to transform your everyday life. But we want to provide you with a next step. We think that that's really important. And so go back to that email and click the next step link. And thank you all so much for tuning in. I'm gonna close our time in prayer, and I'll ask these guys to join me. And if you're watching, join me in prayer, thanking God that He raised Jesus from the dead. Let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you that you did raise Jesus from the dead. We believe that. And we know that it's a faith claim, Lord. It's something that we have to take a step of faith to believe. But we believe it happened, and we believe it makes great sense of everything that came after it, and makes sense of so much else, Lord. And we also believe it's incredibly beautiful and incredibly gracious. And so we're really grateful for it, Lord. I pray for all those that are watching this video, no matter who they are, no matter where they're coming from, no matter what their story is, Lord, I believe that you love them desperately and that you desire them to be in your family. And the way into your family is to trust in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so prompt them towards that, Lord. Help them to take that next step. Stir up their hearts by the power of your Holy Spirit to do that, Lord. We're so grateful for Holy Week. We're gathering differently. We're worshiping differently in the midst of this global pandemic, but Holy Week remains the same. And so we take special care this week to pause and remember the central truth of the Christian faith, that after Jesus was dead and buried, 3 days later, he rose again. We pray all of this in his risen name. Amen. All right, thank you guys so much. Appreciate it. You can go ahead and say goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye. Thanks so much for watching.